Hi, everybody. Thanks for joining me. If you are just starting on this lecture, there is one previous that outlines the clinical diagnosis of trauma and discusses various trauma disorders. So this one is pretty short. It's just going to give you kind of an overview of various types of trauma to know about. And then the next presentation actually moves into discussing childhood trauma and adversity and how this impacts your life across the lifespan as you grow into an adult and how it impacts your relationships once you're an adult. This one's going to focus on various types of trauma that one can experience based off of many different things. It can be age, gender, job. There's a lot of different elements that can influence the type of trauma that you're most vulnerable to. All right, so let's get started. So first, I want to clarify, trauma is not always a major event. It can be a series of events. And this is often what leads to something called complex PTSD rather than just PTSD. It can be a single event or a series of events that the person experiences over a lifespan. They do not have to personally experience the trauma. So it can be they witnessed it happening to somebody else. They learned about it happening to somebody they love. Trauma is definitely influenced by our relationships as well as the environment, genetics, our body. There's a million influences that come in to change the dynamics of how trauma occurs, how it feels, how it influences us, etc. Even trauma therapists, which I consider myself, and first responders are at risk. Some may think this is obvious, but some people don't think about this. They think that they have high resiliency. I listen to people share about trauma stories every day that are very intense and detailed at times, and you think that the person just has a ability to handle that, but it takes maintenance. Um, First responders and therapists, people who work directly with people experiencing trauma, they are definitely at a higher risk for compassion fatigue and burnout, which we will discuss. And there's this concept of big T and little t trauma, which means it doesn't have to be a major life-changing event for it to be trauma. It can be a negative statement made by a parent at the right time when you're younger. It can be mom not being available because she has to work two jobs. It can be a lot of different things. It doesn't have to be a major event. It can be a series of events that seem, mainly neutral or not, a big deal to most people. But it depends on that person's ability to handle those situations, their window of tolerance, their level of resiliency. So everyday trauma in society, we're talking about primary trauma. This is when the individual directly experiences or witnesses a traumatic event. And then this is the reaction to this is, fear, helplessness, or horror. Um, so a good example of this is 9/11. So 20% of the people who were near the Twin Towers and witnessed the Twin Towers attack actually developed or met clinical criteria for post-traumatic stress disorder after 6 months of this event. Environmental trauma is going to be when people experience poverty, lower, limited access to education, previous trauma as a child that adds to their experience later in adulthood, dysfunction within the family, they lose a parent or the parent's not available, and there's also cultural influences that can add to environmental trauma. So environmental trauma basically consists of things that happen external to the individual in their environment. Complex trauma is one that we mentioned briefly, which is repeated exposure to trauma events, repeated exposure to adversity can develop PTSD. It doesn't have to be one major event. So CPTSD includes all the symptoms of PTSD. Some things that are additional or highlighted would be the somatic symptoms like headaches and nausea. Disassociation might be more common with people with CPTSD. Difficulty in interpersonal relationships, even developing an attachment to the abuser because they could be experiencing these small t traumas over and over a period of time. And during that time, they're also connecting to that individual. And then these core beliefs that about themselves, they're just very damaged, very altered, very distorted because, again, this is a long period of time where the person can have time to really identify multiple experiences that they identify as quote unquote evidence of they are not good enough or they are not lovable. And commonly addiction is a struggle, maybe even more so with CPTSD, because the individual is experiencing these things over a long period of time and they're looking for a coping skill. And although drugs and alcohol are terrible for you and destroy your life if you abuse them, they are an excellent coping skill in the moment to deal with, trauma, horror, etc. So everyday trauma for the professional, not just the typical walking around the world everyday kind of person. Vicarious trauma. This is basically due to exposure. So counselors who have to hear these stories over and over and over, first responders who have to show up on the scene and see these horrific scenes that have occurred, witnessing, the aftermath of trauma, witnessing the pain that people that are involved in the situation experience, witnessing and hearing about the terror that the trauma survivors endure. So clinicians can develop a state of tension and anxiety and preoccupation about these trauma experiences. First responders also develop the state of tension and preoccupation, not only of the stories, but also of witnessing the scenes and witnessing the impact that it has on the civilians involved. Compassion fatigue is when the professional um, begins to feel just exhausted emotionally and physically. And this basically impacts their ability to empathize with the individual, to put the energy into feeling compassion. And it can look like the individual doesn't care or that they're very disconnected, but really it's that they're just overly exhausted and fatigued by these exposures over and over and over to these stories and to these interventions and these experiences and relationships with the people that they serve. Burnout is something that happens over a long period of time, typically continues to build, and the professional becomes disconnected, apathetic. They become unhappy in their position. They're discouraged. They don't even want to go to work. They even get to the point to where they become angry or resentful at their clients or their job. And this can lead to anhedonia in their work setting and their personal life, which is a lack of interest, pleasure, and motivation in things that they used to find enjoyable or interesting. So again, this was just a very short one. It's just to kind of make you aware that there are different types of trauma. We will move into childhood trauma in the next presentation, and then we get into the stuff that I really like, which is what's going on in the mind and the body. The references for the September 11th information is this article here in the Journal of Medicine. So if you want to look at that, and then just a referral to the statistical manual, the DSM. If you have any questions, comments, or concerns, I know this is a very quick one, but feel free to send them to me on my website, theanxiousmammal.com. You can just go to the contact page and send me the notification through there. And I will see you at the next one, hopefully. Thank you.